right now because, so it took me a very, very, very long time to write this book. A very long time, like an inordinately long time. And partially it was because this story, as it unfolded, I realized that I did not have yet the skills, the lenses, or the capacities to make sense of the story yet. And that was also because of who I am in relation to the story. And so as I kind of share a bit of this book with you, I want to start with that acknowledgement that while, kind of research presents itself as an individual achievement, it's just my name on this book. It's actually a collective process, and it's sustained by community, and I'm really lucky to have many members of that community here today. Kate, whose book, I read a book in her class when I was going to become a tree and soil ecologist, and then I decided not to do that anymore, so she basically changed my life. Alistair, who was my dissertation advisor, and when I showed up in his office being like, I know about trees and microbes, will you help me learn about like institutions? He was like, okay, sure, and which was a can-do attitude that I try to now bring to students who come to me. My wonderful colleagues at St. Mary's College, several of whom are here and who've kind of helped me grow and learn in so many ways, and then many other members of kind of my academic community, but also my life community. So my fantastic neighbors from Oakland, which I just left. So this means a lot that this collection of folks who are here today, I think sustained the process of producing this work. So thank you all for coming. And for those of you who are new to research or haven't done much research yourselves, it's a very odd endeavor, and it's about giving form to something that is inherently messy. So this book was, first it was just all those field notebooks, and I have really, really bad handwriting. So then it was also about making sense of what I had written and trying to kind of piece together these various pieces. So the book is an ethnography, and it is an ethnography that took place almost over a decade. So beginning with initial field work in 2011, and my last field visit that went into this book was in 2022, just after the pandemic. So I also feel like I grew up with this case. I learned so much about myself through writing this book and this case, and I know I have much to learn going forward as well. So I thought, because I was like, oh, how do I give this book talk? Maybe I can do one of those fancy things where I just read. So I thought I would try that, just to see how it goes, if I can pull it off. So I thought I'd start you off with a story from the book, and without telling you much about where the book is set or who the characters are, as a way of kind of introducing some of the actors and the dynamics, and then I'll kind of go in a little bit more into what is the book trying to tell us about the politics of sustainability, about how to reconcile these goals of trying to heal our planet, of trying to build a world that can sustain both people today and into the future, while at the same time addressing the deep harm and violences that have existed in our past and continue into our future. And I'm sure all of you who walked here today witnessed those violences, right? We see these kind of profoundly deep inequalities, indignities all around us, and we also hear about environmental crises, the overaccumulation of plastics, of climate. So in my book, it's an attempt to try and also think about those things together, about this question of inequality and injustice in relation to sustainability. So if you will tolerate it, I'm going to read a story, and I'm going to show you some pictures which actually go along with the story. And because when I tell stories, I put on my storytelling voice, I would ask you to respectfully prepare for that. Are you ready? Mm-hmm. Stop. Stop stealing the milk packets, shouted Kranti, a 38-year-old tech executive at a multinational company in Bengaluru, India. She was screaming at 3 Paura Karmikas, sanitation workers, so people who clean streets, who were hastily chucking high-value recyclables from a moving truck onto the tin roof of a scrap shop. I was in Kranti's car on a Sunday morning in November 2012, as we followed a truck collecting recyclables from apartment complexes in her neighborhood. these weekly collection trips were the centerpiece of the zero waste initiative that Kranti had launched in KK Nagar, which was the neighborhood that she lived in. This neighborhood, KK Nagar, had emerged in the late 2000s in this city called Bengaluru, which was expanding very tremendously. Bengaluru, a city in South India, known sometimes as India's Silicon Valley. So KK Nagar was a newer neighborhood in Bengaluru, and this is where Kranti lived. And this is where she had set up and started this zero waste initiative. So Kranti was upset because she saw the actions of these sanitation workers as a betrayal of the ideals of her zero waste initiative, which were to keep recyclables out of landfills by diverting them to legitimate value chains, such as the Wealth Out of Waste program run by ITC. ITC was formerly known as the Indian Tobacco Corporation, and today it just goes by ITC. It wants to forget its deep, dark tobacco past. We won't let it. And it is also one of the largest producers and sellers of fast-moving consumer goods. So all those nice things you see, so, your little sweets, your biscuit packets, and as well as other things like that. So Kranti really, she had set up this initiative to implement recycling in her community, and she was like, okay, we're going to collect all this good recyclable material and we're going to send it to ITC, because ITC is going to know how to deal with this properly. They're going to make sure that everything is recycled. But the workers had different ideas. Instead, they were, actually subverting Kranti's visions, what she wanted, by claiming the value in waste for themselves and doing what they had long done, selling recyclables to scrap dealers in the informal economy to supplement their meager pay. So I was talking to Kranti, we're in the car together, and I asked her, okay, why are you doing this? And she's like, I wanted to invest some of my time and energy to improve the long-term health and sustainability of my community. Kranti told me. Frustrated seeing garbage on her street day after day, she impugned the municipality and the waste contractor. They kept not collecting garbage regularly. I'm quite sure he is corrupt. But when an activist from a citywide advocacy group made a presentation at her workplace about community-based waste management programs, she decided to take matters into her own hands. With the help of 3 retired men, one of whom is pictured here, she recruited 200 households, asking them to segregate their waste into different categories. So the wet waste was collected every day, but the dry waste was collected once a week, and it was transported to the shed where it was weighed and then sold to ITC for a bulk rate of basically like 5 cents per kilogram. And so during these weekly trips, and Kranti, she had a full-time job, she had 2 kids, but every week she spent several hours in the morning following essentially these workers around to see how the people who had agreed to participate in her recycling scheme were changing their behaviors, as well as how people were actually kind of enacting these new systems that were coming about. So we were following, I was in Kranti's car, we were following these workers, and at each of our stops, the workers, 2 women and 1 man, they went through bins pulling out paper, plastic, and other recyclable materials. Kranti asked them to put on gloves, but it was not very practical to do this work with gloves, so it didn't really stay on very long. One woman wore a jacket that was issued as a uniform by the contractor, but otherwise there was no personal protective equipment in sight. These people were just working with the waste. They were just dealing with the waste. And the parukarmikas, the sanitation workers, they bent and knelt, sorting on the floor, while all of us stood staring. And honestly, it was a little awkward, and I was encouraged to take photos as they were doing their work. And at some point, we found rotting flowers and diapers in a bin marked recyclable waste. And Kranti immediately, she admonished the apartment level leader, saying, oh, what's this? This is not done correctly. But then the workers, they just picked up the diaper with their hands and moved it to the right bin, without any ceremony, saying anything much about it. So soon after visiting 8 apartment complexes, we were following the truck, and suddenly it took a turn into a side lane. And as we caught up, we realized that the workers were rapidly throwing out all the highest value recyclables onto this small shop. And out went the cardboard boxes and milk packets. Once the workers realized that we had caught up with them, they stopped and quickly drove on. So then we got to the sorting center, Kranti confronted the workers about what had happened. They sidestepped her censure with half-hearted nods, voicing their frustrations to their boss in Kannada. We would get so much more money if we sold the mal, the valuable materials, to the scrap shop, rather than just giving everything to ITC, this corporation, for 2 rupees. It's so stupid to give it away so cheap. Shut up, shouted their supervisor. Kranti tried to placate them. Look, after all, we give you some of the money from the sale and breakfast too. But the Polykarmikas, the sanitation workers, were unhappy with the scrutiny. Even if the money accrued by selling recyclables was ultimately distributed to the workers after reducing unspecified operating costs, they resented losing control over the process. The middle-class volunteers, in contrast, had no visible financial motives and did not see the need to sell the recyclables for a higher price. Their priorities were clean streets and a clean ecological conscience. And they wanted to get back home to hot lunches with an afterglow of a morning's worth of civic duty under their belt. So it was, when I was kind of following these women and men around, it really struck me that they were doing a tremendous amount of work to try and get control of this problem of waste in their communities. You know, I met and interviewed and spent time with about 100 women who were involved in these neighborhood-based initiatives, really coming together, investing a lot of time and energy to create these collectives, these care-based collectives that were trying to transform behaviors, infrastructures, as well as laws on how to manage waste in the city of Bangalore. And they were even having a lot of success. They had managed to shift some citywide policies, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And in some ways they were surprised at their success. They would keep saying that things like, oh, I'm so surprised. Who are we to tell the government what to do? A ragtag group of housewives. But then they also recognized that they were able to demonstrate a different way of dealing with the problem of waste. And that's what gave them this power and authority to speak from. But consistently, across all these movements, if you just looked beyond these women, you could always see the workers. The workers were actually doing these tasks of waste sorting. They were the ones who were creating and maintaining these infrastructures. And if you take a second, you will realize that every environmental act you think you're doing in your life, there's someone doing work beyond that, behind that. And indeed, but often these workers were not part of the story. Very rarely were they, involved in designing these systems. They were, in many ways, they were silenced. They were silent executors of what these systems were. And so, for a long time I thought, well, maybe this is the story, right? This is a story of how environmentalism and environmental initiatives basically reproduce existing inequalities in society. And indeed, for a long time I thought this was the story. But actually, something else was also happening in Bangalore around the same time. So because these waste management systems that were being devised by these environmentalists required a lot of manual labor, suddenly there was a need for workers who had knowledge about waste, who had knowledge about the materials that made up waste streams. And this metabolic dependency on work and workers created some new political opportunities. And indeed, a few weeks before Kekinagar, I was in the Karnataka High Court, where a middle-class environmental group called the Clean and Green Forum had just filed a lawsuit. So it filed a particular kind of lawsuit called a public interest litigation, where it told the government, hey, you are violating my right to life by not maintaining environments properly. And it is your duty to fix this problem because the presence of garbage on the streets is impacting my ability to live. And what was most surprising was that alongside, your usual suspects, right? Like well-off, well-educated women and men interested in environmental issues, were a group representing waste pickers. So who are waste pickers? Well, you probably saw some on your way here, if you were paying attention. Waste pickers are individuals, families, and communities who make a living by extracting materials that can have value, that have resale value from waste, from discards. So they do their work on the street, in municipal dumps and transfer stations. I'm sure those of you who put put your recyclables out maybe at night, sometimes have someone come and look through and pull those out, and often maybe you don't do it so they don't pick it up. So the waste pickers are essentially people who go through garbage to extract materials of values. And they are part of a very large and substantial informal economy that is actually responsible for 30 to 50% of all the recycling that happens in the world, and particularly in developing countries. So the informal economy, which consists of waste pickers, but then also waste collectors who go from door to door, middle agents who aggregate these materials, and then recycling plants supply, they extract these resources that can be, so whether that's paper, plastic, metal, textile, from waste, and then feed this back into manufacturing industries. And worldwide, it's estimated that anywhere between 18 to 20 million people make their livelihoods exclusively from waste picking, but this number tends to go up at times of economic downturn, because when there are no other jobs available, people turn to waste to make ends meet. And just in case you think this is just something that happens in the global south, clearly it's not. You walk down the street in San Francisco, but also for the kind of significant amounts of plastic and other sorts of waste or scrap that leaves the United States and Europe and goes to other parts of the world. So you may or may not know this, but Kate can tell you more. But when you put things in the recycling bin, there's a strong likelihood it leaves this country. And it might go either to other parts of the global north, or it could go to the various parts of the developing world. Historically, a lot of plastic waste went to China, and then China was like, no, we don't want this anymore, and now it's going to many other places, Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, India, Turkey, Egypt, and in these places, waste is often dealt with by people in the informal sector, who are the ones who are going through these mixed materials, sorting them, aggregating them, and essentially turning them into something that can be used, turning something that has been thrown away into something that can be used again. And in many, as this newspaper article from Bangalore says, often waste pickers are not looked at in a very, let's say, loving or favorable manner. And as this article says, no empathy for informal waste pickers. They're seen as dirty. The strong negative perception was attributed to the physical appearance of waste pickers. But actually, there's a little bit more to this story. The strong negative perception of waste pickers is also very, very closely tied to the system of caste. So now I'm going to read briefly from the book to tell you a little bit about caste, and the caste and caste system can also be understood as a form of racialization. Racialization being the process by which certain people, communities, and bodies are marked as less than, as unworthy, as different, so as to justify treatment that we would not impose upon ourselves. So a marking in order to justify oppression, humiliation, control. So to go back here, so in Bengaluru, as with other South Asian cities, working with waste is a stigmatized occupation because of its relation to caste. Waste removal through manual scavenging has been forced on Dalits, historically referred to as untouchables, a term I henceforth avoid, and I recommend all of us avoid, because its very use is a form of symbolic violence. Caste, just like race, enshrines inequality and dehumanization in routine ways in Indian society. Dalits and others who work with waste, especially human waste, are routinely subject to physical, structural, and symbolic violence. Working with waste is associated with humiliation, while also exposing pickers to toxic substances and deadly working conditions. Those who work with waste are usually assumed to be lower caste or Dalit, subjecting them to caste-based stigma. In other cultural contexts, waste picking is racialized work disproportionately carried out by Afro-Brazilians, for example in Brazil, indigenous people, ethnic and religious minorities. So, all to say that waste pickers have it really hard. They have it extremely hard. in the context of Indian cities, but also globally. Because on the one hand, they are doing this work that involves, it's physically really hard work, but they're also doing it in a context where they are socially and symbolically stigmatized, othered, dehumanized. So what was especially kind of remarkable about this movement was suddenly waste pickers were standing next to environmentalists and saying, hey, together we are going to figure out how to fix the problem of waste in the city. And indeed, they were quite innovative and clever about this, including, for example, by this interesting poster was made by a waste picker organization, where they drew on the environmental anxieties of middle-class people who wanted to live in clean and green cities, as well as the need to try and solve these environmental problems without spending too much money, to fashion themselves as entrepreneurial environmentalists. To say, we are the ones who can deliver the clean and green cities that you all so desire in the most efficient manner possible. So what I do in the book, is I try to kind of take garbage or waste, this problem of unmanaged waste that is in Indian cities, there's a lot of it. And just to give you a brief sense, the city of Bengaluru, where the book is situated, has grown so much in the past 20 years. I first went to Bengaluru, so I grew up in India. I think most of you know this about me. And I went to Bengaluru as a child, and for me it was like some sort of paradise, because it's a little bit cooler, it had all these trees, it was the cool city. But in the 25 years since my childhood visits to Bengaluru, the city has changed a lot. It has grown tremendously in physical size, kind of swallowing up everything around it, grazing lands. It has also grown in population, where it went from about 3.5 million residents in 1985 to nearly 10 million people in 2021. Now, alongside all of this, Bengaluru is also sometimes called India's most cosmopolitan city. And indeed, if you go to Bengaluru and if you or your kids are used to all the nice American brands, you'll feel completely at home, because all of that is well and truly present and represented. And you can get McDonald's, you can get KFC, you can get I think you can even get a Tesla now. So it's really made it. So Bengaluru has grown a lot. It has grown a lot in size and number of people, and then the people who are living in Bengaluru are also consuming. They're consuming in ways that are much more similar to people living here in the United States or in Europe than to rural Indians. But this growth and consumption has also been tremendously unequal. For example, what this graph shows you is that while overall greenhouse gas emissions have grown in India, if you break this down by income, you will see that the top 20% of Indians emit about 7 times as much as the bottom 20% of Indians, which is a similar difference to the average American and the average Indian. So this growth story, the story of plenty that is often projected as the success of India's development strategy, has been a highly unequal one. And you also see it in cities, where just behind that mall, you have an informal settlement. You have people living with almost no access to kind of the basic services of sanitation, of waste collection, etc. And so how I actually came to this research project was also because I was experiencing these changes as somebody who grew up in India at this time when all this consumption was booming, and at the same time you had growing environmental impacts such as air pollution. My mother was asthmatic, so she would keep getting asthma. I myself, my crowning achievement as a child was that I had malaria 6 times. Which is a mosquito-borne disease, and the reason why I kept getting malaria is we lived next to essentially choked up, a river that was choked up with garbage, and therefore was always kind of this breeding ground for mosquitoes. And because my mother was asthmatic, we were never allowed to use any of the mosquito repellents in our home because they smell. So essentially, we just kept getting mosquito-borne diseases. And so it was, for me, it was essentially this question of, well, if we're seeing so much environmental impact, right? If these externalities of growth are in front of people's faces, well, are people responding in any manner? Are they able to kind of what is being done? What can be done? And this was essentially what also brought me to the question of garbage, because garbage or uncollected, unmanaged waste was probably the most visible and visceral evidence of the failures or the inherent contradictions of this growth story. And everywhere you look in Indian cities, you see this. You see this uncollected garbage, and it kind of indicates that, well, something is not quite working here. And indeed, because of its presence, because of its ubiquitous presence, because of its daily presence, in many ways, in the book I argue that garbage is also democratizing. It's something that invites and enables action by a diversity of people. And so the people that I center in this narrative, first and foremost, are these middle-class zero-waste movements, largely women-led, as well as comprising older people, retirees, who come together to try and tackle this problem of garbage at home by changing how they consume, by convincing their neighbors to do different things, and as well as setting up new systems of dealing with waste that, as opposed to trying to push the problem elsewhere, try to tackle it through these practices of reuse, refuse, reduce, and recycle. I also look at how garbage invites action from poor people who, often in the absence of other work opportunities or seeking more flexible forms of work, turn to waste as a source of livelihood and become the people who extract these valuable materials, who are engaged in tasks of repair, of refurbishment, and these economies that have built up around waste. And so in centering these two actors, but also looking at how they interact, in some ways, this book is a hopeful story, because what I found was, in many ways, these two groups, who in many ways are so opposed, right? So you have these well-off women from these Brahmin families, like the one I am from, who really, do not at all concern themselves with social justice issues. These are not activists. These are not people with class consciousness. They really aren't. But rather, because of the shared concern around trying to deal with this environmental problem, come to find themselves in solidarity with waste pickers who are also engaging in waste. And together, this coalition of middle-class environmentalists as well as waste pickers managed to do very many things in the city of Bengaluru. Some of these were explicitly targeted at improving the lives of waste pickers. So one remarkable achievement was that together they advocated for a program to give identity cards to waste pickers. And why is this important? Because, maybe as you already know this, when you put your recyclables in the bin, it becomes the property of whoever is been contracted to deal with recycling. So when then somebody comes in and takes something from the bin, they're stealing. So similarly, waste pickers were often seen as stealing, and indeed, because they were seen as stealing, and also because of caste, they were subjected to police violence, to various forms of aggression. So what these identity cards did was it recognized waste picking as an occupation, effectively decriminalizing waste picking and giving waste pickers a form of protection from the various quotidian harassment and abuse that they were experiencing. Also worked together to support waste pickers in gaining access to various social services, such as health insurance and retirement schemes, which previously they did not have access to. So some of these kind of joint efforts were explicitly targeted at improving the conditions of work and life and dignity for waste pickers. Others were targeted at trying to push the state to do something different with respect to how it was trying to solve the problem of unmanaged garbage. So in many Indian cities, the kind of default option to deal with municipal solid waste has increasingly become large waste to energy plants, such as the one pictured here. So the one here was built in the city of Delhi, in Okla, and since it was commissioned, there's been a lot of research showing that actually the incineration technology used here was really not a good technology in terms of local environmental pollution. Also, the incinerator meant that many waste pickers who were, because there's a really funny thing. So it turns out to burn waste, it needs to be a what's known as high calorific value, okay? So it means it needs to have a lot of paper in it. But Indian waste is actually mostly organic waste. It has low calorific values. So when they set up this incinerator and they started trying to operate it, they found that it wasn't working too well because the waste was of too low a calorific value. So they were like, everybody stop recycling. We need your paper. We need to put paper in the incinerator so it burns. So this incinerator essentially undercut existing recycling economies, dispossessing waste pickers from work, and at the same time producing local environmental pollution for the communities living, shift to another slide, living next to the landfill. So what instead, was in Bangalore, knowing that these things had happened in Delhi, middle-class environmentalists and waste pickers got together and said, look, we're going to come up with a different solution. We don't want an incinerator in Bangalore because it's bad for health, and it's also bad for waste picker livelihoods, and instead we're going to suggest that you set up a network of decentralized recycling centers. Middle-class people will be the volunteers who go home to home, teaching people how to change their behaviors and teaching them how to recycle. Waste pickers will be the ones who actually run these centers and make sure that the material is processed quickly and fast and diverted to the appropriate recycling schemes. So it was really an example of where these two communities came together to come up with a new infrastructural system that helped avoid the outcome that happened in these other cities like Delhi. And once waste pickers were inside these infrastructures, so suddenly they went from people on the outside, people who are always ignored, stigmatized, criminalized, to actually having a role, a position to play in the maintenance of urban environments, and they effectively used their power, the newfound authority and legitimacy they had within these infrastructures to make more claims, to say, okay, now, we said we'd do this job with our hands, but turns out it's much easier to do it if you give us a little bit of machinery. Come on, can you give us a little bit of machinery? So from initially saying that they would do all this with zero subsidy on the cheap, once they were in the system, they were able to use their position to try and push for greater investment in their own kind of work, in their own livelihoods, in their own well-being, in their own reproduction. And including sometimes holding the state to account when it failed to deliver on its promises, like making payments in time for waste pickers. Another interesting thing that middle-class actors and waste pickers managed to do together was to try and push back against brands and large companies that try to consistently shift the problem of waste onto the consumer and onto workers. And this is a story we hear all the time, right? Why are cities dirty? Oh, it's because the city is not doing its job, the municipality is not doing its job, the workers are corrupt, they're inefficient, the waste management companies are bad, because consumers don't care, or people are just lazy and they don't do the right thing. We hear this all the time. But what was interesting was because these groups came together, on the one hand, consumers were able to say, oh, no, we are changing our behaviors at home. Look, we've got 50,000 households now segregating their waste into 7 categories. And then workers were like, look at all the accounts we're keeping. We have all our spreadsheet. We can tell you what we're collecting and how much. And so much so that they also began to kind of keep track of what were the brands that most of this waste that was coming into these centers, and using this data and this advocacy to push responsibility back onto large corporations and back onto the state, and to say, no, we are doing our part of the bargain. The issue here is y'all. Y'all are not keeping your end of the bargain. And so to engage in this type of joint advocacy to try and push for more transformative solutions, such as, for example, banning certain forms of packaging, banning certain forms of materials, pushing for more investment in public infrastructures in order to deal with the problem of waste. And so, for example, this waste and brand audit being a moment where these things were coming together. So maybe this is a hopeful story. Maybe this is a story of actually how two communities who had very little in common came together to try and find mutual shared understanding and to push for new solutions. In many ways it is, but also in the book I warned that there is always a danger of these local place-based solutions being captured and being instrumentalized by the forces of capital. And I'll end by kind of making some warning statements in relation to that. So as I said, around garbage, you have these middle class environmentalists, you have waste workers, but you also have the state, you have the government. And particularly in India, we have something called the Swachh Bharat campaign, which is Narendra Modi's one of his flagship governmental campaigns, where he's trying to clean up the country in order to show the world that it's modern. But his way of cleaning it up, honestly, is a little wacky, in the sense that the campaign really emphasizes notions of kind of individual responsibility and citizenship, but at the same time privatizes everything and tries to make money from waste. So on the one hand, they're like, we need to clean up the city, but on the other hand, they're like, let's also make some money cleaning up the city. And then this whole idea of turning waste into this new frontier for economic growth and value production is increasingly what we see in relation to the circular economy agenda. So I don't know if you all have heard about this term circular economy yet, but if you look around for it, you might see it in the adverts of large brands, as well as in initially I think some municipalities are also using this. And the idea of the circular economy is that if we figure out how to take things that we're throwing away, right, and we figure out how to make markets for them. That means we figure out how to make them valuable, and we can figure out how to, make money selling these things that have been thrown away. We can fix the problem of waste. And so today there is increasingly more and more interest in trying to turn waste into something that becomes a commodity, something that can be sold, and that if we turn it into a commodity, it will no longer be something that just lies on the street, because now someone has value for it. Now you will be like, wait, wasn't this what waste pickers were already doing? Correct. This was what waste pickers were already doing. And indeed, in many ways, waste pickers were the innovators of treating waste as a commodity frontier. And along with other, other kind of scrap dealers and other people who have been turning to waste as a source of value, they're the ones who initially did this. But now, more and more people are coming to do this, including really, really large brands, powerful actors. For example, Danone has a project in Ghana partnering with waste pickers to try and kind of create waste markets. The Body Shop is really big into this, Coca-Cola, H&M, all of these actors, for many reasons. One, because they're getting a lot of shit for their, the fact that they're producing all this environmental pollution. So they're like, okay, we need to do some stuff, so they don't try to regulate us too hard. Look, we're recycling more. Look, we're using more recycled content in our products. So they need to deal with these regulatory pressures. They also want to see if, okay, is this a new avenue for growth, for diversification, for their own companies. So increasingly, many of them are turning to those same piles of waste that waste pickers were dealing with, and looking at it as a way to perhaps create some new forms of economic activity. And you see these proliferating partnerships between brands in the global north and companies and informal sector workers in the global south that are trying to set up these new ways of kind of bringing recycled materials back. So all this while, right, once you and I got finished with our cans and we put it in the recycle bin, and it got nicely put into a container and sent to China and sent to Vietnam and sent in Cambodia, now it's about bringing it back. It's about H&M saying, oh, our buttons are made with recycled plastics. Or, oh, this nice little bottle of shampoo you bought, made with recycled plastics. So we can all feel good about ourselves. It's also a big part of a lot of this environmentalism. Well, maybe this is a good thing in some ways, right? So maybe there are these new systems and value chains that are emerging around recycled materials. But in the book, I warn that actually in many ways, as large companies come to try and turn waste into a commodity frontier, it is bad news for waste pickers. And it's bad news for waste pickers for a simple reason, that a lot of these initiatives simply do not question the socio-cultural hierarchies that exist within the waste system. Which is that, as I talked about at the very beginning, waste pickers, people who deal with waste, are humiliated, stigmatized, and subject to various forms of violence because of caste and because of race. These initiatives, these environmental initiatives, ignore these aspects. Sometimes they condone them. Sometimes they use them. Because if you use them, you can actually get these people to do the work as cheaply as possible. If you hold them in subordinated and subjugated positions, where they do not necessarily have the rights or the capacities to push back and to demand better wages, to push back and to say, no, we are not going to accept this bad deal, if you retain these socio-cultural systems of hierarchy and stigmatization, then it makes it cheaper. It makes it cheaper to get this work done. And this is what ideas of racial capitalism tell us. And so racial capitalism, which is a concept I work with in the book in relation to caste, tells us that within capitalist economies, various forms of differences, ethnic, regional, religion, are exaggerated into racial differences so as to essentially sanction the systematic exploitation and expropriation of racialized groups. And this systematic exploitation and expropriation of racialized groups, what does this show up like? Well, it means that when these companies come and say, we want recycled plastics, right? Well, we want to work with informal waste pickers. They very rarely work directly with informal waste pickers. Instead, suddenly this guy shows up. And his job is to say, you know what, these informal waste pickers, they know how to do the job, but they don't know how to count. They don't know how to keep track of all the things that you company need to keep keeping track of. So I'm going to come in, I'm going to put myself in the middle, and I'm going to figure out how to, help these guys do their job better while, delivering to you company the nice recycled materials you want. But in reality, this person is now also trying to make money with waste. So suddenly you have a new actor who's coming in and who informal waste workers either have to work for this person or they're going to get pushed aside by this person. So what does this look like? Which is that once you decide that a particular group is less than, is not as efficient, is not as productive, is essentially less worthy, you can set up these mechanisms where it makes complete sense to set up a system where you need a new actor to come in and serve as an intermediary connecting these economies. And so, you have a group of smart guys who are engineers, who are business guys coming from Silicon. Actually, many of them are coming from Silicon Valley, so if you see any of them coming, maybe you tell them not. Trying to build a sustainable, scalable business. And in this process, I found that even when informal workers got included into these systems, they were still doing the worst work. They were still the ones bending. They were still the ones doing the difficult manual work, not having regular payments, having work contracts that were not stable, being exposed to various forms of pollution, and they also constantly had to demonstrate themselves as worthy, as professional. We should be included because we know how to do this work well. While for the people coming in from the outside, these dominant caste, foreign creators of startups, even though they had never worked with waste before, in many cases, they were actually in some cases like, students who had come to study something and then decided to start a business. Their expertise was never questioned. And for that, I think we have to look seriously at the ways in which caste and race contour who we think has legitimacy and the expertise to solve environmental and sustainability problems. So I'll close by saying that, so my book ultimately argues that by bringing together these unlikely alliances anchored in material action, communal sustainability, people coming together, can serve as a terrain that produces politics that impedes this market-based, neoliberal, technocratic capture of sustainability. However, this transformative potential of local action is constantly threatened by the commodifying and co-opting forces of global capitalism, which threaten to subsume these place-based experiments into a corporate green growth agenda. And ultimately, because communal sustainability doesn't question these socio-cultural hierarchies of race and caste, it is available to be captured, to be instrumentalized in the service of capital. And so as I end the book, waste pickers are already doing a lot of the work. They are organizing, they are showing up in various places to stake their claims to better lives and better livelihoods. But then the onus now is on environmental activists, it's on policymakers to ask this question of how can we imbue an anti-caste practice into sustainability, an anti-race practice into sustainability. How do we bring our commitments to humanization, to undoing these systems of socio-cultural oppression and imbue them into the ways in which we try to create a more sustainable world. So I'll stop there with those two images. So, thank you.